Tim Noetzel is the founder of Allora Design Marketing and also a coach to tech startups. He says that when it comes to networking, a deliberate and strategic approach works best. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast, Tim.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
Now, you're a web developer, a product designer, a business coach, all rolled into one. But let's go back to the beginning. What's your background? What was your first job that you did?
Yeah, so my first job out of college, I was working at a company called Deloitte Consulting in their strategy and operations division. And though I didn't really realize it at the time, and they probably wouldn't have called it that, I was actually doing user experience design.
Okay. And how would you describe user experience design for people that might not know what that means?
Yeah, so UX is really about solving problems for the user of a product or piece of software. So thinking about how do you make a product easier to use? How do you make that product more sticky? How do you help users use the product successfully? So, whereas a visual designer, right, is much more concerned with how the product looks, UX designers are more concerned with how it feels and how it functions.
Yeah. So what did you learn in that first job that you then took on into your next stage of your career?
Yeah, I think ultimately it was about problem solving, right? How do you design pieces of software in ways that help people solve business problems?
Yeah. And so when did you decide to go work for yourself?
Yeah, so after Deloitte, I worked for startups in and around Boston for about 15 years, leading technology teams in various forms. So leading development, leading design, leading product groups. And in 2019, I actually found myself in the middle of a job search. The startup world is notoriously volatile, and so there's oftentimes a lot of things changing all at once. So I was looking for a new job. I wasn't really excited about any of the things that I was finding. I got a couple of offers, but ultimately turned them down and decided maybe it's time for me to start my own consulting firm and help different startups with different problems.
Yeah. And so that was 2019, so not long before the pandemic happened. How did that affect you?
I think actually it was incredibly good for my business. Obviously, there were, all sorts of other things going on with the pandemic, but one of the effects that I saw, and I know a lot of the other, freelancers and consultants that I know saw, was that companies were having to do more with less. And the result was that they often turned to consultants who could wear, kind of multiple hats, who could provide a mix of execution, but also strategic advice. And so I think in many ways that actually fueled the growth of my business quite a bit.
Yeah. So tell me about the business you run now. What's it called and what do you do?
Yeah, so the company is called Allora. I do web development, design, and conversion rate optimization, mainly for tech startups and e-commerce companies. And, it's really kind of a mix of strategy and execution. So my clients hire me because I have, frankly, seen so many different startup scenarios and have really kind of a bird's eye view of how successful growth is achieved. But I can also, help teams actually implement the steps, whether that's through coding or design, to make it happen.
Yeah. And where are the companies that you help? Are they in a particular part of the world or do you help people all over the place?
Yeah, so I actually have clients all over the place. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts, so several of my clients are here, but I also have clients throughout the Northeast, some on the West Coast, and a couple in London.
Right. That's the nice thing about the internet, isn't it? It doesn't really matter where you're based anymore.
Exactly.
So what kind of stage are the businesses at that you tend to help?
Yeah, I'd say that they tend to be kind of mid or late stage startups. Most of them are kind of between 5 and 50 employees, though I do have a few that are more like 300. And, usually have at least $1 million in revenue, but some of them are substantially larger than that, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue.
And what kind of problems do they come to you with?
Yeah, so a lot of it is about how do we increase the volume of sales on our website? How do we increase the stickiness of our products or services and keep users or customers coming back again and again?
Yeah. And are there some kind of common mistakes you see that people make when they're starting out in business?
Yeah, I think there's, honestly, I think there's a whole host of them. In my mind, one of the biggest is just not having a good understanding of the types of problems that you're really solving and whether those problems are kind of must solve for your customers. I think oftentimes people give the sort of, creating a better toothbrush example, right? Where the reality is that, the toothbrushes we have today pretty much get the job done. So, if you try to introduce a better toothbrush, right, it's a really kind of an uphill battle to get people to adopt it. Whereas if someone, a company is fighting tooth and nail to increase their revenue, for example, and you've got a solution to actually solve that problem, right? That's a must-solve problem for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, something that I know you're sort of very keen to help people work out is who their ideal client is. So how do businesses work out who their ideal client is? And is it always who they expect it is?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it's not who they expect it is. And, I in addition to freelancing consulting, I actually coach developers, designers, copywriters, and others on how to build freelance businesses. And oftentimes I think people come in with an idea in their head of, oh, I want to serve this type of client because that's what I'm familiar with, but those aren't necessarily the best types of customers. And so I think from a consulting standpoint, the best clients are those who can afford to pay premium rates, are actually interested and prefer to pay premium rates because they want, experience and strategy, not just, someone to type on a keyboard a little bit, right? And they're familiar with the norms of the type of work that you're trying to do, right? So they require less hand-holding, they ask smarter questions, they give better feedback. Ideally, they're also easy to sell to. And I think you can actually kind of extrapolate from that to what ideal customers look like anywhere for any type of business, right? They're people who have a must-solve problem, really care deeply about solving it, right? It's a priority for them, and really value the type of solution that you're creating, right? If you have, that kind of mix and, there are enough of those customers and you can reach them relatively easily, you've got a successful business.
Yeah. And so once a business has worked out, who their ideal client is, what should they be doing with that information?
Yeah, I think there's two things that they'll want to do. Number one is make sure that the product or service that they're selling actually meets that customer's needs, right? In sort of the lean startup methodology, we talk a lot about product market fit, and the idea is, it's not enough to have a product. It's not enough to have an ideal customer, right? What you want is a market, right? A group of accessible customers who all have the same problem, and for whom your product or service solves that problem.
Yeah. So let's have a little chat about networking now. So how have you used networking for your business?
Yeah, so actually networking has really been kind of the pillar of growing my consulting business. I discovered very early on in 2019 that a lot of the other methods of finding freelance clients just didn't work very efficiently. So, in 2019, when I started out, it was a few months before my wedding. So I was saving for a wedding. I was saving for a house. So I knew I was going to have to figure something out really quickly. In those first few months, I really tried everything. I tried freelancing sites. I tried social media, and a whole host of other things. And I kind of discovered two things about marketing in general. Number one, the more crowded a channel is, the less trust there is, the harder it is to use that channel to break through. And the channels I kind of just mentioned are exceptionally crowded. Oftentimes with low quality providers, but in the case of something like social media, also with companies trying to market services that are in no way competitive to yours, but also are competing for your customers' attention. And so I found that those things really just did not work very efficiently. I was having to spend tens or hundreds of hours to get a single client, which just wasn't a recipe for success. But I really found that taking kind of a strategic approach to relationship building was highly efficient. And so, when I think about networking, it's much less about that, go to a networking event and work the room kind of approach, and much more about saying, okay, these are who my ideal customers are. Let me figure out where they're hanging out, both online and in the real world, and who already knows them and could potentially introduce me. And working through those two exercises and then methodically having conversations with people one-on-one worked really, really well for me.
And so where did you go to start building that network?
Yeah, so I think there were kind of two places I went. One of them was, just the local hubs in my area. So startup accelerators, co-working spaces, industry meetups, that kind of thing. And having conversations there, but they're, very highly targeted for who my clients were. And I also made sure to do kind of my homework and check out who was going to be there ahead of time, so that I could, make sure to go have individual conversations with the exact right people, and not waste anybody else's time. So that was one of the two avenues. But the other avenue that I found that worked just incredibly well was building relationships with other freelancers and consultants, particularly those in complementary fields. Right. So, as a developer and designer, networking with marketers was fantastic. Because they already knew my ideal clients, were already working with them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had successful businesses. But they weren't competitive to me, right? So they'd be willing to introduce me. Not only that, they tended to be the first people that my ideal clients would ask for a recommendation when they were looking for someone like me.
Yeah, those kind of networking relationships are vital, aren't they, to your business? Those are the golden nuggets.
Exactly right.
So is networking something that you encourage your clients to do as well?
Yes, yeah. The people that I coach, I think, have largely seen sort of the exact same situation play out, right? Many of them come to me after they've been trying freelancing sites or social media for a very long time and just not having much success, and find that oftentimes within just a couple of weeks, they start meeting new clients, and that the quality of those clients is substantially higher than the ones that they were getting previously.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what kind of hints and tips do you give people for networking effectively?
Yeah, so I think, largely speaking, the advice I give kind of falls into two categories, right? One of them is how you approach people, and the other is how you kind of position yourself. And in terms of an approach, I think people who are thinking about networking from sort of a sales standpoint assume that they have to go in and start pitching people. And I think in large part that is a huge mistake. Because the reality is people don't want to buy from someone who they've never met before, and they may not actually have the problem that you're looking to solve, but that doesn't mean that they can't be helpful to you and vice versa. And so I typically recommend that people either go in with an approach of asking for advice or an approach of offering advice or other value. And so, asking for advice, for example, if you're talking to someone who theoretically could be a potential client but you don't know yet, explain what you do in the business that you're building. Ask if they've ever worked with freelancers before. Where did they find them? What worked well? What didn't work well? The great thing about that is people love to be helpful. It actually makes them feel good about themselves. And if they have a problem, if they've got a project that needs somebody like you, they'll raise their hands and let you know. And then you can start pitching them, right? When they've basically opted in to being sold to. If not, oftentimes they will volunteer to introduce you to other people. And if they don't, you can even ask for introductions. Are there other people you'd recommend that I talk to who might also be able to provide some advice? So that approach works extremely well. I also recommend, particularly if you have a great deal of expertise, considering ways that you can give that expertise away and offer your advice. And that might be presenting to an industry meetup or putting, a panel together, oftentimes for people in sort of those complementary industries. So, as an example, if you were a UX designer, right, you could offer to put together a panel or, present on design for programmers or design for, engineers, right, and teach a group that, probably doesn't know nearly as much as you, but has the need to understand pretty well the type of work that you do, as an example. So that kind of thing I found, just thinking through how are you going to approach the people you're talking to in a way that's, natural and adds value and isn't overly salesy is hugely important. I think the second piece is just how you position yourself so that you stand out, right? I think the vast majority of people sort of will just describe themselves functionally. Oh, I'm a developer. Oh, I'm a designer. And when you do that, right, the way you stand out, or the way that you appear, doesn't stand out, right? And you end up looking just like every other developer, or designer, or what have you, right? Instead, I recommend thinking through what are the business problems that you're solving and present yourself that way, right? So when I am talking to someone that I haven't met before, from an industry standpoint, right, I will explain that I'm focused on helping startups increase revenue and get traction, right? And that I do that through development and design, right? But talking in that way, offering examples of results that you've gotten for clients can be highly effective.
You need to give people a reason to remember you, don't you?
Exactly.
And I think, as you said about sort of positioning yourself as an expert by being a speaker, that anytime I think you get the opportunity to speak, that's a really valuable opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can get in front of your ideal clients in a way that demonstrates your expertise, that builds trust. And that trust is hugely valuable in the sales process, but it's also just valuable from an awareness standpoint. The number of times that I've gotten referrals from someone I talked to a long time ago who, months and in some cases years ago, who didn't have the need themselves, but, came across a colleague at another business who did have that need. Those have been some of my best clients.
And that's the way networking works the best.
Exactly.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for being my guest today, Tim. If people want to find you and find out more about what it is you do, what is the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, they can find me at freelancegps.com, which is where I coach on how to build successful freelancing and consulting businesses.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, and the best of luck with your businesses and your networking.
Thank you for having me, Liz.